Serafina!
The carriage was already moving. Not quickly. It had only just pulled away from the front steps of Kingscote Manor, the horses finding their pace on the gravel drive, the morning grey and still in the way of mornings that do not know yet what they are going to be asked to witness. Serafina Glass was inside it with her trunk strapped to the back and her hands in her lap and her face arranged in the expression of a woman who has made a decision and is committed to it and is absolutely not going to look back at the house. She did not look back at the house. She looked at her hands instead, which were not doing what she had told them to do, which was to remain still. They were doing the other thing, the thing they did when she was managing something large and not entirely succeeding at the managing. 9 months. She had been at Kingscote for 9 months, and she had done the work, and she had done it well, and she had made the catastrophic, irreversible, professionally ruinous error of telling the truth to a man who was not ready to hear it. And now she was in a carriage with her hands misbehaving and her trunk strapped to the back and 9 months of a boy's slow, extraordinary, hard-won progress behind her. And she was. The carriage stopped. Not gradually. It stopped the way carriages stop when the driver has been startled into pulling the reins. Abrupt, the horses shifting. A sound from outside that she could not immediately identify because it was not a sound she had heard before, and it took her a moment, sitting very still in the stopped carriage with her misbehaving hands, to understand what it was. It was a child's voice. It was Dominic's voice. One word. Spoken into the grey morning of the Kingscote Drive with the clarity of something that has been held inside a person for 10 years and is coming out with all of that pressure behind it. Her name. Serafina. She was out of the carriage before she had decided to move. The door was open and her feet were on the gravel, and she turned and he was there, 12 years old, in his indoor clothes with no coat despite the cold, having clearly run from the house because he was still running, closing the last of the distance between them with the desperate, ungainly speed of a child who is afraid of being too late. He reached her and he stopped. He looked at her with the eyes she had spent 9 months learning to read, dark, deep, the eyes of someone who has been watching the world with full attention from behind a silence the world had decided to call absence, and his face was doing something she had never seen it do in 9 months, which was everything at once. Everything he had ever not been able to say. He put his arms around her. He was 12 and he was tall for 12, and he pressed his face against her shoulder and she felt him shaking, and she put her arms around him and she held on, and behind him on the front steps of Kingscote Manor, Godfrey Benedict, 10th Duke of Ashmore, was standing absolutely still with the expression of a man watching something he does not have words for, which was, for a man who had spent 10 years watching his son have no words, its own kind of reckoning. The household had come to the door. Cassandra Pye, who had run this house for 20 years and prided herself on having seen everything, had her hand over her mouth. The footman beside her had forgotten entirely what his face was supposed to be doing. Quentin Quarles, who had arrived that morning for what was meant to be a final consultation, stood in the entrance hall with his case still in his hand and his professional composure entirely misplaced. They had all heard it. One word. 10 years of silence and then one word, and the word was her name. But let me tell you how we got here. Because the boy had been silent since he was 2 years old, and the man on the steps had been silent in his own way for just as long, and the woman holding the child in the driveway had been told, in this very house, 3 weeks ago, that she should focus on her work. 11 seconds. This is a story about 11 seconds and what lives on either side of them. Have you ever been 11 seconds from leaving the best thing that ever happened to you? Stay with me. Serafina Glass had been dismissed from her previous position on a Tuesday in March, which she had always thought was an unremarkable day for a remarkable humiliation. The family had been the Alderton Vaughan's of Fawley Court, a mother with strong opinions about education, a father with no opinions about anything beyond his horses, and 3 children of varying ages and temperaments whom Serafina had genuinely liked and who had, she believed, genuinely liked her. She had been there 14 months. She had taught them to argue respectfully and to read critically and to ask why rather than simply accepting what they were told, which she had believed, arriving, was the point of education. Mrs. Alderton Vaughan had believed the point of education was compliance, and she had said so in the letter of dismissal, which had used the word dangerous twice and unsuitable 3 times, and had declined to provide a reference. Serafina had read the letter in the small room that had been hers for 14 months, and she had folded it and put it in her bag, and she had packed her trunk with the same quiet composure she brought to everything, and she had left Fawley Court on a Wednesday morning with the internal silence of someone who is not going to give a situation the satisfaction of a reaction. She had kept the silence for 3 weeks. Then she had applied for the position at Kingscote Manor, because it was the only position available that did not require a reference from her previous employer, and because the advertisement had described the child as presenting with selective mutism of extended duration, requiring a governess of patience and unconventional method, and something in the phrase unconventional method had felt, to a woman who had just been dismissed for exactly that, like a door opening. She had not known then what 10 years of silence looked like in a child. She had not known what it cost a house to organize itself around that silence. She had not known what Godfrey Benedict looked like or how his face moved when he talked about his son, which was with the careful, controlled neutrality of a man managing a situation and calling it love. She had arrived on a Thursday in September with her trunk and her letter of application and the composure of a woman who has one more chance at this and knows it. Kingscote Manor was larger than she had expected and quieter than any house she had worked in, which was saying something, because houses with children were generally not quiet. Cassandra Pye met her at the door with the expression of a woman who has seen 11 governesses come and go in 10 years and has strong feelings about the 12th that she is professionally obligated to keep to herself. "Miss Glass," she said. "Not a welcome exactly. An acknowledgement." "Mrs. Pye," Serafina said. "I understand the position has been difficult to fill." Something moved in Cassandra Pye's face. "The position requires a certain kind of person," she said. "I have been told I am a certain kind of person," Serafina said. "It has not always been meant as a compliment." Cassandra Pye looked at her for a long moment. Then she opened the door wider and stood aside, and Serafina understood this was as close to a welcome as she was going to get and walked through. The house was beautiful in the way that houses are beautiful when they have been maintained with great care and lived in with very little joy. Everything in its right place, everything clean and ordered and correct. The kind of house that has decided presentation is the same as habitation and has been wrong about this for years. She met Godfrey Benedict that evening. He came to the study where she had been taken to wait, a large room, book-lined, with the fire recently lit as though someone had remembered at the last moment that a guest was expected and warmth was required. And he came without announcement, already in the middle of something, his attention organized around whatever he had been doing before this and redistributing itself toward her with the efficient focus of a man for whom attention is a resource carefully allocated. He was perhaps 42. He was not what she had assembled from the letter. She had assembled someone older, somehow, the word Duke having a tendency to conjure an image that Godfrey Benedict did not match. He was simply a man who looked as though he had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had stopped noticing the weight because it had been there long enough to feel like his own body. "Miss Glass," he said. "Your Grace," she said. He sat down across from her and looked at her with the assessing attention of a man who has interviewed 11 governesses and has a clear picture of what has not worked. "I will be direct with you," he said. "I would prefer it," she said. Something moved in his face. Not quite the machinery for smiling, but the awareness that the machinery existed. "My son has not spoken in 10 years. He was 2 years old when the accident occurred. He has been examined by 6 physicians and 3 specialists, and 14 months ago Quentin Quarles, who is considered the foremost authority on childhood mutism in this county, examined him for 3 days and concluded that the condition was psychological in origin and might resolve with the correct environmental approach." He paused. "He has had 11 governesses. The longest stayed 4 months. "What ended the 4 months?" Serafina said. He looked at her. "She told me Dominic was unteachable." "What did you say to that?" "I told her she was dismissed." Serafina looked at her hands. Then at him. "What ended the others?" "Various things," he said. "Frustration. Pity." One of them wept in front of him, which he found. He stopped. He did not respond well. "He doesn't want pity," Serafina said. "No. He wants to be treated as though the silence is a condition and not a definition." Godfrey looked at her for a moment that was slightly longer than the previous moments. "Yes," he said. "I believe that is correct." "Then we agree on the starting point," she said. "Which is further than I have gotten in some interviews." He was quiet for a moment. "You come without a reference from your previous position." "I do. The letter of dismissal, which your former employer was kind enough to forward without being asked, uses the word dangerous." "It does. Are you?" She looked at him directly. "I taught 3 children to ask why," she said. "Their mother found the results inconvenient. Whether that constitutes dangerous depends entirely on what you are hoping to protect." Godfrey Benedict looked at her for a long time. "You may start Monday," he said. She met Dominic the following morning, which was a Friday, because she had decided that waiting until Monday was waiting for the sake of waiting and she did not see the point of it. She found him in the library. He was sitting in the window seat with a book open in his lap and the expression of someone who had heard her come in and was performing not having heard her, which she recognized because she had taught children long enough to know the difference between a child who does not notice you and a child who has decided to pretend not to notice you, and the second kind was always more interesting. She did not say good morning. She walked to the shelves and she looked at the books and she pulled one out and she sat down in the chair nearest the window and she opened it and she read. She read for 20 minutes. At some point during those 20 minutes she became aware that Dominic was no longer performing, not noticing her. He was watching her with the open, unguarded attention of someone who has been presented with something unexpected and is trying to work out what it is. She turned a page. "This," she said, without looking up, "is the worst ending I have ever read." The author had 3 perfectly good options and chose a 4th that satisfies no one and insults the reader's intelligence. She turned another page. From the window seat, Dominic made a sound. Not a word. Not yet. Not for 9 months yet. But a sound that was somewhere between agreement and amusement, from a boy who had apparently also read this book and had opinions about the ending. And Serafina looked up at him over the top of the page, and he looked back at her with the expression she would come to love most in him, which was the expression of someone who has just discovered there is another person in the world who sees the thing they see. "You've read it," she said. He nodded. One firm nod. "And the ending?" He made a gesture, a small, expressive movement of the hand that communicated something she interpreted, correctly, as an insult to everyone involved. "Exactly," she said, and returned to the book. She stayed for 2 hours. When she left she did not say goodbye. She simply closed the book and stood and walked out the way she had walked in, without ceremony, as though she would be back tomorrow and they both knew it. She would be back tomorrow. He was in the library when she arrived. The weeks that followed had a shape she had not planned and could not have planned, because it was the shape of 2 people finding a language between them that did not exist yet and had to be built from available materials. Dominic communicated in several ways that were not speech, expressions, gestures, written notes in a small notebook he carried, and a system of responses: 1 tap for yes, 2 for no, 3 for you are wrong and I will explain why, that Serafina had established in the 2nd week and that he had adopted with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of infrastructure. She taught him and she argued with him and she read to him and she brought him books she wanted to discuss and discussed them using his half of the conversation as fully as her own, and she treated his 3 taps with the same respect she would have given a spoken counter-argument. And he expanded into this treatment the way a plant expands when you finally give it the right conditions, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily and visibly, week by week. Cassandra Pye watched all of this with the expression of a woman revising an opinion she had formed quickly and is not entirely comfortable revising. "He ate at the table with the household last Tuesday," she told Serafina, 6 weeks in. "He has not done that in 3 years." "I know," Serafina said. "He told me." 3 taps and a very expressive look. Cassandra Pye was quiet for a moment. The others treated the silence as the problem. "The silence is not the problem," Serafina said. "The silence is how he has been surviving. You don't remove someone's survival mechanism. You make surviving less necessary." Cassandra Pye looked at her with the expression that had been moving, over 6 weeks, from suspicion towards something warmer. "The Duke should hear you say that," she said. "The Duke," Serafina said carefully, "and I have different approaches to Dominic's situation." This was an understatement. Godfrey Benedict was present in his son's life in the way that a weather system is present. You were always aware of it. It affected everything, and direct engagement with it was something you prepared for rather than sought. He came to the schoolroom twice a week. He sat in the chair by the window, the same chair, always, and he watched Serafina teach his son with the attention of a man trying to learn something he does not have a name for yet. He did not interfere. She had expected interference, had braced for the variety of interference that came from fathers who had decided what the problem was and wanted the solution to match the diagnosis. He did not offer it. He sat in his chair and he watched, and occasionally, when Dominic produced something unexpected, a drawing that demonstrated a grasp of perspective no one had taught him, a written response to a text that revealed a mind of considerable sophistication operating behind the silence, something moved in Godfrey's face that was not the managed neutrality she had come to expect from him. It was longing. He was watching his son with longing. The longing of a man who is in the same room as something he loves and cannot find the way to it. She looked away before he could see her looking. Quentin Quarles came in November, for what Godfrey described as a routine consultation and what Serafina understood, from the 3 days of warning she was given and the quality of the household's preparation, was something considerably less routine. Quarles was a man of perhaps 50 with the bearing of someone who has been correct about enough things that he has stopped leaving room for the possibility of being wrong. He arrived with a case of instruments and a set of opinions fully formed and a manner toward Dominic that Serafina watched for approximately 4 minutes before she had to leave the room to prevent herself from saying something that would end her employment. She went back after 4 minutes because leaving Dominic alone with it was not an option. Quarles had Dominic seated across from him and was speaking in the slow, overclear voice that people used for children they had decided were less capable than they were, asking questions that required yes or no answers and making notes in a ledger when Dominic provided them with his tap system. "He understands you," Seraphina said, from the doorway. Quarles looked at her. "I beg your pardon." "He understands everything you say. He is not impaired in comprehension. He is selectively mute, which means the mechanism for speech is present and the barrier is not physical." She stopped. "He is also sitting directly in front of you and is entirely capable of finding this conversation condescending, which I believe he currently does." She looked at Dominic. "3 taps if I am wrong." Dominic did not tap. Quarles looked between them with the expression of a man whose professional methodology has just been questioned in front of his subject by a governess, which was not an experience his professional history had prepared him for. "Miss Glass," Godfrey said, from somewhere behind her. She had not heard him come in. She turned. He was standing in the doorway with the careful neutral expression he deployed when something was happening that he had not yet decided how to respond to. "Perhaps," he said, "you might allow Dr. Quarles to complete his examination." "Of course," she said. She looked at Dominic once more, a look that said I will be outside. 3 taps means come and get me, and she left. She sat in the corridor and she was very composed about it. Godfrey found her there 40 minutes later, when Quarles had gone to write up his notes. "You undermined his examination," Godfrey said. "His examination was undermining your son," she said. She looked up at him. "Dr. Quarles is a man of considerable reputation who has decided what Dominic is and is gathering evidence to support the decision. He is not curious about Dominic. He is confirming a diagnosis. Those are different activities." Godfrey looked at her for a long moment. "Quarles has been consulted on Dominic's case for 4 years." "I know," she said. "And in 4 years Dominic has not spoken. I have been here 8 weeks and he laughs. Not out loud, not yet. But the sound he makes when something strikes him as funny is closer to a laugh every week, and that is not nothing and it is not Quarles." She said the last part more directly than she had intended and she saw it land in Godfrey's face, and she waited for the response that would tell her she had gone too far. He said, "No, it is not Quarles." He walked back into the room. She sat in the corridor for a moment longer, and her hands were doing the thing again, and she addressed them firmly, and they did not listen. Quarles returned in January for what he described as a follow-up assessment. He spent 2 hours with Dominic. Seraphina was not in the room. She had been explicitly not invited, which she received with composure and which Dominic received, when she told him, with 2 rapid taps and an expression that communicated his opinion of the arrangement clearly. Afterward, Quarles presented his conclusions to Godfrey in the study. Seraphina was not present for this either. She was in the schoolroom with Dominic, who was drawing and occasionally making the sounds that were now arriving more frequently, sounds with intention behind them, sounds that had the shape of trying. That evening Godfrey came to find her. "Quarles recommends," he said, "a course of treatment involving a residential facility in Edinburgh. 6 months. Specialists in situ. He believes it is the only remaining avenue." She looked at him. "He also believes," Godfrey continued, "that the current environment has produced some progress but has reached its natural limit." He paused. "That the attachment Dominic has formed with his governess is a dependency rather than a development, and that removing it is necessary for the next stage." The room was very quiet. "And what do you believe?" she said. Godfrey looked at the window. Then at her. "I believe," he said, "that my son ate dinner at the household table for the first time in 3 years last month. I believe he laughs now, or something close to it. I believe he shows me his drawings." He stopped. "I believe that 6 months in Edinburgh away from everything familiar would undo every one of those things." "Yes," she said. "It would." "I have written to Quarles," he said, "to decline his recommendation. I have told him that we will continue with the current approach and that his services will not be required further." She looked at her hands. "Thank you," she said. "I should have said it 8 weeks ago in a corridor," he said, "when you told me it was not Quarles." She looked up at him. He looked back at her with something in his face she was not going to examine tonight. "Good evening, Miss Glass," he said, and left. She sat for a long time after he had gone and was very sensible about everything and did not entirely succeed. December arrived and with it the quality of Kingscote in winter, which was a house that had been beautiful in summer and was austere in winter and was, Seraphina was finding, most itself in the evenings when the fires were lit and the formal distances of the household relaxed slightly and Dominic sat across from her in the schoolroom with a book and his notebook and the expression of someone entirely at home. She had not intended to love this house. She had not intended to love this child, which was a professional failing she was aware of and could not correct because the awareness and the feeling were running on separate tracks and the feeling had got ahead. She had not intended any of what was happening to her in the evenings when the household had settled and she sat in the small sitting room adjacent to the schoolroom and read, and sometimes became aware, without looking up, that she was not alone, that Godfrey had come to stand in the doorway, not to say anything, not to ask anything, simply to be in the vicinity of the lamp and the fire and whatever it was that the room had become in the evenings that the rest of the house had not. She looked up one evening in December and he was in the doorway and she said, "You could sit down." He said, "I did not want to intrude." "You are already in the room," she said. He sat down. They read in silence for an hour, which was the most honest hour she had spent in a very long time. And when he stood to go he said goodnight in a voice that had something in it she was not going to examine. And she said goodnight back in a voice that she hoped had nothing in it that could be read, and she was not certain she had succeeded. January and February built the way that things build when two people are in a house together and both of them are being very careful and the carefulness is becoming its own kind of pressure. Dominic was changing. Not in a way that could be pointed to in a medical report. Quarles was gone and would not be writing reports. But in the way of a child who is becoming more himself, which was the only change that ever mattered. He sought her out. He brought her his drawings. They had become more detailed, more inhabited, the careful observational records of a boy who looked at the world and wanted to account for it accurately. He had begun, in the schoolroom, to make sounds that were not quite words but were moving in the direction of words, sounds with intention behind them, sounds that had the shape of trying. She did not remark on it. She had learned, with Dominic, that remarking on progress was the fastest way to make it retreat. She simply received the sounds as she received everything he gave her, as communication, complete and valid on its own terms. Godfrey had seen it. She knew he had seen it because she had seen his face in the schoolroom doorway when Dominic made a sound one Tuesday afternoon that was the closest thing to a word he had produced in 10 years, and what was in Godfrey's face in that moment was something she had to look away from because looking at it directly was more than she had the composure for. She sat with this for 3 weeks in January and 3 weeks in February, and by the end of February she had arrived at the conclusion that she was a practical woman who believed in honesty and that the honest thing was to say the true thing to the relevant person and accept the consequences. She asked to speak with him on a Thursday evening in March. She told him in the study, standing, because sitting felt wrong for what she was about to do. She told him that she had not come to Kingscote looking for anything beyond the position, and that what had developed over the course of the past 6 months had not been sought by her and was not something she had any expectation he would receive well, and that she understood completely the complexity of his situation and his son's situation and the professional nature of their relationship. She told him that she was in love with him. She said it the way she said everything, directly, without softening, with the composure of a woman who has decided and is now delivering the decision and is prepared to stand in whatever comes back. What came back was silence. Not Dominic's silence. Not the silence she had learned to read as language. This was a different silence. The silence of a man who has been handed something he was not prepared for and whose first response is to find the container for it. Then he said, "Miss Glass, I think it would be best if you focused on your work." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the managed neutrality she had spent 6 months watching him deploy at everything that came too close, and she understood, with the complete clarity of a woman who has just heard the exact thing she most feared hearing, that he had chosen the container over the thing he had been handed. "Of course," she said. She left the study. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed and she was very composed for a very long time. 3 weeks. She gave it 3 weeks because she was a professional and she had a job and she was not going to abandon Dominic for the sake of her own feelings. And for 3 weeks she came to the schoolroom every morning and taught, and she sat in the library every afternoon and argued about books, and she did not go to the small sitting room in the evenings, and she did not look at the study door when she passed it, and she folded everything she was feeling into the smallest possible shape and she put it somewhere she could not see it, and she went to work. On the last day of the 3 weeks she understood that she could not continue. Not because the feeling had diminished. It had not, would not, she was experienced enough with herself to know it. But because continuing required her to be in the same house as a man she loved who had told her to focus on her work, every day, indefinitely. And she was a practical woman, and the practical assessment was that this was not survivable. Not in any form that left her intact. She wrote a letter of resignation. She packed her trunk. She arranged the carriage for Thursday morning. She went to the schoolroom on Wednesday afternoon and she sat with Dominic for 2 hours, and she did not tell him she was leaving because she could not find a way to tell him that would not undo something that had taken 9 months to build. She told herself he would be all right. She had changed enough in him that he would be all right. She told herself this with the focused conviction of a woman who needs to believe something and is prepared to work at believing it. She did not entirely succeed. Thursday morning. The carriage. The trunk strapped to the back. The drive beginning to move under the wheels. She was looking at her hands. They were doing the thing. She addressed them and they did not listen, and she was about to look away from them and look at the road instead. Look at the road and the gates getting closer and the life she was going back to, which was small lodgings and no reference, and the very specific grief of having left something before you were ready. The carriage stopped. And then the sound. Serafina. Her name, in a voice she had never heard before because it had not existed before this moment. In a voice that was breaking slightly with the effort of 10 years compressed into 4 syllables, in the voice of a 12-year-old boy who had been 2 years old the last time he had found a word and had spent 10 years in the country on the other side of words and had now, for this reason and no other reason, come back across. She was out of the carriage before she had decided to move. She held him for a long time on the gravel drive of Kingscote Manor while the household watched from the doorway and Godfrey Benedict stood on the front steps and did not move. She held him and she felt him shaking and then, gradually, not shaking, the way a child settles when they have been afraid and are now held and the fear has some way to go. She held him until the shaking stopped, and then she held him a little longer because she was not ready, and she thought, from the way his arms tightened, that he was not ready either. When she finally stood back, she looked at his face and he looked at hers and she said, "That was very well done." He made a sound. The sound was not quite a laugh, but it was the closest thing to a laugh she had heard from him, and she thought she would carry it for the rest of her life. She looked up. Godfrey was still on the steps. He had come down 2 of them during the holding. She had not seen him move, but he was 2 steps closer than he had been. And he was looking at her with the expression she had spent 6 months looking away from, and was now, standing in his driveway with her trunk on a carriage and his son's arms still loosely around her, looking at directly. It was not managed neutrality. It was a man who has just watched the thing he is most afraid of losing leave through his front gate, and has understood, too late and then exactly in time, what that means. He opened his mouth. She said, "Don't." He closed it. "Not now," she said. "I am going to take Dominic inside and I am going to have tea with him and I am going to stay for the rest of today because he asked me to and I would not refuse him that." She looked at Godfrey steadily. "What you have to say can wait. It has waited this long." Something moved in his face. "Yes," he said. "It has." She took Dominic inside. The carriage waited in the drive. She did not leave that day. She stayed for the tea and for the afternoon, and by the time the afternoon had become evening she had not left and no one had asked her to leave, and the carriage had been quietly unpacked by a footman who appeared to have received instructions from someone, and her trunk was back in her room. She did not speak to Godfrey that evening. He did not come to the small sitting room. She understood this as its own kind of message. The message of a man who was trying to give her what she had asked for, which was time, and she sat with her book and the fire and the quality of a house that has been holding its breath for 10 years and has, today, let some of it out. He came the next morning. He came to the schoolroom, which was where she was always to be found in the mornings, and Dominic was there with his notebook and his drawings and the new quality he had that was still new enough to be astonishing, which was the quality of a boy who had spoken one word and had discovered that the world had not ended and was now sitting with the enormous question of what word might come next. Godfrey stood in the doorway. She looked at him. He looked at her. Dominic looked between them with the focused attention of someone who has been watching adults communicate in the spaces between words for his entire life and is extremely good at reading what those spaces contain. "Dominic," Godfrey said, without looking away from Serafina, "might I borrow Miss Glass for a few minutes?" Dominic tapped once. Then he made a gesture, a small, shooing motion, which communicated, clearly, "Go on then," with an undertone of "it is about time" that was so entirely Dominic that Serafina had to look at the window to manage her expression. He came to her in the corridor outside the schoolroom, and he stood in front of her and he was not managed. That was the first thing she noticed. The management was gone, not misplaced, not temporarily set aside, but gone, the way things go when a person has decided they cannot afford it anymore. "I said something unforgivable," he said. "You said something cowardly," she said. "Those are different things. Unforgivable means there is no way forward. Cowardly means you were afraid." "I was afraid," he said. "I have been afraid for 10 years. Of a great many things. I had become," he stopped. "I had become a man who managed things," he said. "And you were not a thing to be managed, and I managed you anyway, and I am." He stopped again. "Godfrey," she said. It was the first time she had used his name. He went still. "I know what you are," she said. "I have spent 9 months learning what you are. You are a man who has been carrying a grief that arrived before he got home and has been running the household and the estate and his son's medical situation and everything else as a substitution for being allowed to grieve it. And you are also a man who comes and stands in doorways in the evenings and sits in chairs in schoolrooms and reads in sitting rooms in silence and means something by all of it that he does not know how to say. She looked at him. I know what you are. That is not the question. What is the question? He said. The question, she said, is whether you know what you are, and whether knowing it is something you are prepared to do something about. She looked at him steadily. I told you the truth 3 weeks ago and you told me to focus on my work. I need to know that what comes next is not another version of that. I need to know that you are capable of something more than managing. He looked at her for a long time. I don't know yet, he said. I know that yesterday morning you left and I was standing in this house and Dominic ran past me and I understood, watching him run, that he knew something I was still, that he had found the thing I was refusing to find. He paused. I know that I have been refusing it. I know that refusing it has cost more than I was told it would cost when I decided to refuse it. That is honest, she said. I am trying to be honest, he said. I have not been very practiced at it. No, she said. I would like, he stopped. I would like the opportunity to be more practiced at it. If you will allow me the opportunity. She looked at him. I am not going to decide that today, she said. You told me to focus on my work 3 weeks ago and I am going to need more than one morning in a corridor to set that aside. She straightened. I am going to stay because Dominic asked me to stay, and I am going to do my work, and you are going to have to show me, not tell me, show me, that the man in the corridor is the man you intend to be and not the man you were for a single morning when you were frightened. Yes, he said. That will take time. I have time, he said. We will see, she said, and went back into the schoolroom. He showed her. Not in speeches. She had told him not speeches and he had understood her, which was itself a kind of evidence. In the things he did that cost him something, the small deliberate actions of a man who has decided to stop managing and start being present and is discovering that presence is harder than management in every way that matters. He came to the schoolroom every day instead of twice a week. Not to supervise. He sat in his chair by the window and he participated, as much as a man can participate who is learning alongside his son and is aware that his son is significantly ahead of him. He asked Dominic questions. Not the questions of a man gathering information about a case, but the questions of a father who is curious about his child. And Dominic answered them. In his notebook, in his gestures, in the sounds that were coming more frequently now, sounds with more intention behind them, sounds that were learning to be words. He came one evening to the small sitting room and sat down without being invited. And she did not say you could sit down because he had already sat, and they read for 2 hours in the same silence as before. And when he stood to go he said good night and she said good night, and this time she did not tell herself the voice had nothing in it that could be read. He sent flowers on a Tuesday. Not to her room. To the schoolroom, where Dominic received them with 3 rapid taps and an expression of profound satisfaction that suggested he had been expecting this for some time. He wrote her a letter. Not a declaration. A letter about Dominic. About something Dominic had done that morning that had struck him. About the way Dominic had looked when he solved a problem. And underneath the letter about Dominic was a letter about himself, about what it was to watch his son become more himself week by week and understand that he had been in the same house as this child for 10 years and had not known him, not really, and that he was beginning to know him now, and the knowing was, he had written the word extraordinary and then crossed it out and written more than I deserve and left it. She read the letter twice. She put it in the second drawer of the writing desk in her room. She did not respond immediately. She waited 2 weeks. She was not punishing him. She was a practical woman and she was being practical, which meant she was watching him with the full attention she brought to things that mattered. And she was assessing whether what she was seeing was a man who had genuinely changed or a man who was performing change because she had asked for it. And the difference between those two things was the difference between everything and nothing. Performance has a quality. It requires an audience. It needs to be witnessed. It dims when no one is watching. What Godfrey was doing did not dim when no one was watching. He was different with Dominic in the evenings when she was not there. Cassandra Pye told her this, in the matter-of-fact tone of a woman reporting observable facts, that the Duke had taken to sitting with Dominic after dinner in the library, not doing anything in any obvious sense, simply sitting in the same room, and that Dominic had taken to allowing this and occasionally sliding his notebook across to show his father something. She heard this and she sat with it for 3 days. Then she went to find him. She found him in the study, where she had told him the truth the first time and where he had told her to focus on her work, and she stood in the doorway and he looked up from his desk and stood immediately, which was the thing he had always done, stand when she entered a room, which she had spent 9 months receiving as courtesy and was now receiving as something else. "I have been watching you," she said. "I know," he said. "For 8 weeks. I know. You have not performed," she said. "I was looking for performance and I did not find it." Something in his face. Not the machinery for smiling, the actual thing, brief and unguarded and entirely real. "I have not been performing," he said. "I have been trying to become the man I should have been when you told me the truth in March. I am not certain I am there yet. I am not certain it is a destination rather than a direction." "A direction is sufficient," she said. "I am not asking for arrival. I am asking for the direction." He looked at her across the study. "Serafina," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. She had used his weeks ago in the corridor and had watched it land in him and had understood what it meant to him. And now he was using hers and she was receiving it and understanding what it meant to her, which was that the direction had become, in this moment, something she was prepared to walk into. "Yes," she said. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her and he looked at her with the full, unmanaged attention that was his face without the management, which she had been catching in glimpses for 9 months and was now seeing whole, and he said, "I would very much like to not be a man who tells you to focus on your work." "You are not that man anymore," she said. "I am trying not to be." "I know," she said. "I have been watching." He took her hand. The way you reach for something you have run out of reasons not to reach for. His hand was warm. She had not known it would be warm and the warmth surprised her, and she thought that some things were allowed to go on being surprising even after you had decided to keep them. "I have conditions," she said. Something in his face, the laugh that lived near the surface now, near enough to be visible. "Of course you do," he said. "Dominic is not to be managed," she said. "By physicians or specialists or anyone who treats his silence as a problem rather than a language. He is to be known. Whatever he becomes, however he speaks or does not speak, he is to be known." "Yes," he said. "And you are to come to the schoolroom," she said. "Not to supervise. To be there. There is a difference." "I know the difference now," he said. "And you are to sit in the small sitting room in the evenings," she said, "without waiting to be invited. You have been hovering in doorways for 9 months and it has been," she stopped. "It has been very difficult to read in peace." He looked at her. "I will endeavor," he said, "to be more disruptive." She looked at her hand in his and then at him and she said, "Yes. All right. Yes." They were married in June, in the small church at the edge of the Kingscote estate, on a morning that was warm and unhurried and entirely itself. Dominic stood beside his father. He had been speaking for 3 months by then, not fluently, not yet. The words came slowly and with effort, and sometimes he still reached for his notebook when the effort was more than he wanted to make, and Serafina received the notebook exactly as she had always received it, as language, complete and valid on its own terms. But the words were coming. One at a time, then 2, then small sentences that arrived with the deliberateness of someone who has learned that words are worth the work of finding them. At the wedding breakfast, Cassandra Pye made a speech that was brief and dry and contained, at its end, a single sentence that was not brief or dry at all, which was, "I have kept this house for 20 years and it has been a good house, and it has been, for some of those years, a quiet house, and it is neither quiet nor merely good any longer, and I find I prefer it this way." After the breakfast, when the guests had gone and the house had settled into the quality of an evening that is also a beginning, Serafina sat in the small sitting room with a book she was not reading and the fire and the sense of a room that has become, over 9 months and a marriage and everything in between, entirely itself. Godfrey sat down without being invited. She did not look up from the book she was not reading. She had opened the second drawer of the writing desk that morning, before the wedding, and she had taken the letter out and she had read it again. The letter about Dominic, and underneath it the letter about himself, and the word crossed out and the words written in its place. She had folded it and put it in the small pocket of her wedding dress, against her side, where it had been all day. She took it out now and set it on the table between them without comment. He looked at it, then at her. She looked at her book. From somewhere in the house, the library, where he went in the evenings now with his notebook and his drawings and the new words he was collecting one at a time like a child who has discovered that the world is full of things worth naming, Dominic made a sound. It was a laugh, a full, unguarded, entirely real laugh, at something in a book or a drawing or the quality of an evening that is also a beginning. And it came down the corridor and into the sitting room, and Serafina looked up from the book she was not reading and Godfrey looked up from the letter on the table between them, and they looked at each other. She had spent 9 months learning his face. She knew exactly what it was doing. What would you have done? Forgiven him and stayed, or taken his advice and focused on your work? Tell me honestly in the comments. Leave one word. 11. If those 11 seconds on the driveway were the moment the story stopped you breathing. Doorways. If you understood what it meant that he stood in doorways for 9 months instead of walking through them. Dominic. If the boy who said one word after 10 years of silence was the one who broke you open. If you know someone who has been standing in a doorway of something for too long, send them this. They will know exactly what it is about. Subscribe for stories where the silence says more than the words, the wound goes all the way down, and the ending earns every word that came before it. He had been silent for 10 years. He had been 2 years old the last time he found a word. The word he found, after 10 years, was her name. He found it because she had made him want to. That is the whole of it. That was always the whole of it.